it often isn't someone who's taking out $80,000 to get a bachelor's degree. It sometimes is people who take a few classes at community college or undergrad, and they end up leaving without a degree, aren't able to increase their earnings, and that $8,000 of student debt is worth $12,000 of student debt 5 or 10 years later, and they're just never making headway. They're just paying, essentially interest on it the whole time. It's a huge problem, and I think there's a lot that we can do.
Hi, my name is Owen Smose, and welcome to Youth in the Booth. Today, my guest is Colin Van Ostern. How are you doing, Colin?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing great. So, for the people at home who might not know, Colin Van Ostern is a politician who served on the New Hampshire Executive Council. You've worked as a businessman and worked to lower student debt and consulting with multiple nonprofits. You are now running for Congress in New Hampshire's 2nd District, wanting change for struggling working-class families and preventing extremist power in Congress. You've also been an advocate for reproductive rights and climate awareness. Welcome to Youth in the Booth, Colin.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for doing this.
It's great to have you. So I want to talk about one of the things that I brought up, extremist power in Congress and extremist ideologies. And how do you think when you get in that position that you'll be able to navigate the heightened political polarization that we have in Washington?
I think about this in a few ways. So right now, it feels like too often in Washington, there are extremists, and to be fair, I mainly mean extremists on the far right who have kind of thrown so much sand in the gears of our democracy that it's not working. And that's not to say there aren't extreme views on either side. I just don't think both are an equal threat to our democracy right now in the levels that we've seen in recent years. The way I think about this is the time that I served on the Executive Council. Most of the work that we did was actually bipartisan. Doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of disagreement. Sometimes there was. But I try to think about this through individual people and what motivates each of them. And when I was on the Executive Council, I served with Democrats, I served with Republicans. For one term, it was more Democrats than Republicans. For the other term, it was the opposite.
Right.
But I think about like what motivates Ray Burton or Joe Kenny or Chris Sununu or David Wheeler. These are 4 different individuals I worked with from the other party. Sometimes we disagree a lot, sometimes we'd agree a lot. And what motivated them each was different. But I think understanding who people are as people and what matters to them helps you find ways to work together even when you do disagree a lot.
Exactly. So it's important to find that common ground with other people.
Yeah, and it's not just common ground. I mean, I think it starts with common ground, but the sort of common ground I would find with Joe Kenny, who served on the Executive Council with me, tended to be when we both were trusting local people to make their own decisions for their own communities. Right. And often we both would, that would be a core value that we could find common ground on. The common ground I would find with Ray Burton tended to be about making sure that rural areas had a real voice in our state government. With David Wheeler, look, David was pretty ideological on some things and we had some strong disagreements, but there were some areas where he was skeptical of government doing things right or wanted to have additional oversight where I thought he was on the right track. And so even though we might have an ideological disagreement on some things, I think having an extra eye on government doing things right, having a critical, sometimes skeptical eye is good and appropriate. And so we'd find common ground there. With Chris Sununu, we ended up running against each other for governor, but there were issues where even competitive pressure was one of the ways that you would get things done. One of the issues that prompted me to run for Executive Council in the first place was to restore Planned Parenthood funding. It was a big point of contention in our campaign for governor. We disagreed, and Chris ultimately flipped and voted for funding, for the funding that I supported. And it wasn't because we found common ground so much as I think there was just competitive pressure. And, I think he wanted to be on the right side of voters at the end of the day. He was a smart politician in that regard. I wish he had stayed with that position more consistently, but it's one of the ways you get things done.
So coming from that, do you find these qualities that you've been able to do so far in your government positions that you'll be able to bring the same things to Congress, which in some ways might be even more, politically polarizing? And if you've seen the clips, or people do get quite upset at each other, and
yeah.
It doesn't feel as not very professional in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I don't come into this with rose-colored glasses thinking that I can fix everything because I can have a beer with people and we'll find common ground on every single subject. I do come into it believing that there ultimately is more that unites us in this country than divides us, that even with people of a different political party, you can find real points of agreement. Sometimes it's on specific issues. I know that I think about there was a bipartisan bill recently to support additional funding for veterans, and it had strong support from both Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't a particularly ideological issue. Has made a big difference in my own family, has made a big difference in a lot of people's families. And that's something where I think you could find common ground. And just because some people are kind of celebrity politicians and just trying to go viral on Twitter and be as outrageous as they can doesn't prevent other people from working together to get things done.
You're not, if you were elected to the position, you weren't there to make a name for yourself and talk about all these big things, but things on social media. You want to get things done.
I don't think I could go viral if I tried, to be honest. So it's probably a good thing these days.
I wanted to ask, related to that, what other kind of important qualities and experiences do you feel like someone should have before they decide to run for office?
I mean, I think what's most important is having a deep connection with the people that you are running to represent. I love this district. I have lived here in Concord for almost 25 years now. My wife and I, for a few of those years, lived up in Hanover, which is also part of the district when we were both in business school. Her family is from the North Country, who spent a ton of time there. I used to represent 49 cities and towns across central New Hampshire, going all the way down to Keene on the Vermont and Massachusetts border. And I spent a lot of time in Nashua when I was fighting to get passenger rail in New Hampshire. And so I have a lot of relationships with community leaders and citizens. And I was in Keene just earlier this week, and I was meeting the new CEO of the hospital there, Cheshire Medical Center, doing really interesting, good work. He's been there in the job for 8 or 9 months. I hadn't met him before. He's relatively new. But when I walked into the lobby, I bumped into a couple that I had known when I served on the executive council. They had hosted a house party for me when I first ran for office. And those sorts of ties really matter. It helps you stay grounded as an elected official, helps you do better work. And I think it's where you have to start from when you run, is running to represent the people of your district, the communities, knowing the differences of those people and communities across the state.
So you've obviously met with many people across the state, and I'm sure you've noticed that many families, especially working class families, are struggling with the costs of food, health, housing, college, and just the overall price today of raising a family. How do you feel you can help alleviate this burden?
Well, I've done work in this area both professionally and in public service. And first of all, this is real. This is one of the central issues in my campaign. Really, everything I'm working on revolves around two things the most, which is one, lowering household costs, and two, protecting reproductive rights. I think on the question of lowering household costs, these are things that you hear on the side of kids' sports games. This is not just a political issue. And I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. We spend a lot of time on the sidelines of basketball games lately in recent years. And the things I hear are, people who can't move into a new house because housing prices have gone up so much and interest rates are so high, or they can't get a kid off of waiting lists to get into childcare in their local community, or an older kid is moving back home because they can't afford tuition or student debt. These are real, healthcare costs, particularly for aging parents or older individuals. These are real issues. There are some areas we've made progress on. Healthcare costs is a good example. One of the big projects I worked on the Executive Council, and it took a lot of us to do this, was implementing the Affordable Care Act in New Hampshire, expanding Medicaid. That has resulted, that was 10 years ago. In the last decade, nearly 100,000 of our fellow citizens have gotten better, cheaper health care.
Wow.
As a result. And look, when more people are covered, it means fewer uninsured people show up at the ER, which means fewer costs that are passed on to the rest of us too, even if we have private insurance. And so there's some progress there. There's also way more we need to do. Price of insulin was just capped at $35 a month. That's great, but we can do that for a lot of other drugs too, and bring costs down if we're more aggressive there. On the cost of tuition, I worked professionally at Southern New Hampshire University. I helped launch a new college called College for America, which is part of the online nonprofit university. We were dedicated to the idea that students could graduate from college without going into debt. Nearly 10,000 graduates later, the vast majority of them took on zero student debt at all. Of those who took on debt, the most common amount was less than $2,500 for their entire college degree. And so it took a lot of work. It took creativity. It will take some creativity from the federal government in terms of how we award student aid, what we require from our college programs, even some creativity around kind of taking what people think of as college and kind of breaking it into a part. The coming of age experience is really important. We don't necessarily need to be spending tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on that. There are also a lot of pathways that are not just a 4-year degree, associate's degrees, trade school, apprenticeship programs that are really valuable. And if we do a better job of helping students into more pathways, it can bring costs down a lot.
Just as a young person, I only have 2 more years to go to college. And while it's exciting, it's also scary and concerning because I could be going into, I don't even know how much debt
Yeah.
to schools that I might really want to go to, but the price is so high. And for some others, it could be unachievable, even if they go into loans. Maybe paying that off for probably the rest of their life.
Yeah, it really is a problem. I mean, I experienced this myself, and costs have even gone up since then. So when I was undergrad, chose the school I did based on the financial aid package. Full stop. That was the reason I made that decision. And I was on a sibling scholarship. My sister had to drop out of school when she was there. And so that meant I owed a lot more, very quickly. And I actually ran out of student loans. I put my senior year of college on a credit card. I do not recommend this. I don't even think they allow it anymore. This was in the 90s. But I graduated from undergrad with a full slate of student loans and over $30,000 in credit card debt. And I had not had health insurance for 4 years of college. And I got lucky, frankly. If I had gotten really sick or, broken a leg or something like that, I would have gone bankrupt at 20 years old. And I was lucky to get through it, and costs have gone up even more. And I do think a lot of people, particularly my generation or even older generations, don't fully grasp how expensive it is today and how big of a burden it can be for young people as they graduate from college.
I mean, you just think about the average American afford, and many schools can be 50,000, 60,000, 90,000, over 100 for some.
Yeah, it's crazy.
How do they expect young people to afford this? They don't have jobs yet. They could rely off of their parents' money, but not for everything that they have to pay for.
I also think there are two misperceptions that it's important to break down. One is when a lot of people say college, that word, what they think of is a 18, 19, 20-year-old living on campus pursuing a 4-year degree. That is 18, 17% of the people enrolled in higher education. It's not the majority. It's not even the plurality. There are a lot of people who are making college fit between work and family, who are working as working adults to get an associate's degree, who are pursuing higher education in non-traditional ways. So that's one of the misperceptions, is we need to expand that definition to not just be what some people think about as college. The other is, if you look deeply at students who default on their debt, it often isn't someone who's taking out $80,000 to get a bachelor's degree. It sometimes is people who take a few classes at community college or undergrad and then can't afford to continue, or life takes over, and they end up leaving without a degree, aren't able to increase their earnings, and that $8,000 of student debt is worth $12,000 of student debt 5 or 10 years later, and they're just never making headway. They're just paying, essentially interest on it the whole time. It's a huge problem, and I think there's a lot that we can do.
Right. And there's many other issues which are coming up and are, I think, pretty impactful for young people, or at least are being perceived as impactful. And one of them is reproductive rights. And I wanted to ask your question of, how do you feel like you could connect with young voters over the issue of reproductive rights?
It's really an acute issue in 2024. I'm 45 years old, so younger than your typical member of Congress, but probably older than most of your listeners. For 42 or 43 of the years of my life, women had certain fundamental rights protected by the U.S. Supreme Court that they do not have today, and that is outrageous. It is prompting focus and interest in political activism in some really positive ways after the Dobbs decision, but really so much is on the line in 2024. One of the reasons I ran for office in the first place, probably the central reason, no one ever dreams of being an executive counselor when they grow up. But my executive counselor voted and led the effort for the first time ever in New Hampshire to successfully defund birth control and cancer screenings and annual exams at our state Planned Parenthood health centers. I was 31 years old with a 1-year-old at home and a lot of student debt still. And I ran for office because I thought we needed to fix it. And we did. We got that funding restored. We elected other folks like Chris Pappas, who served with me, who also was another young leader. And we made real headway on that. But what we've seen in the last decade is those issues have been treated like a political ping pong ball, and that's absolutely unacceptable. I think it takes a national law to protect the full range of reproductive rights. That includes birth control. It includes IVF. It includes access to abortion no matter where you live. We can't afford for, it seems like you wake up one week and all of a sudden Arizona has enacted a law from 1864.
I heard about those. Yeah.
We cannot keep living like this, and we can't live in fear that a single election will change fundamental human rights. We have to restore access to the rights that we had under Roe. And really protect the full range of reproductive rights. And it's going to come down to this election to do it.
As we were talking about before, this is another issue that is dropped on these political lines with this new type of political polarization that we're seeing, that it's, you vote for one party, you're in favor, you vote for the other, you're not.
Yeah, I think that's true for political leaders, but not for voters, for what it's worth. access to the full range of reproductive care is something that's overwhelmingly supported in this state and in this district across party lines. A majority of Republicans support that idea. That doesn't mean a majority of elected Republicans do. And I do think it's one of the things that's broken right now is that our leaders are not listening to their voters enough. There's an amazing and I think will be historical line in the Dobbs decision that Justice Alito wrote. And I'll get some of the words wrong, but basically he said women do not, are not without electoral and political power in this country. He's going to live to understand the implications of those words. And there are women and men who have seen these fundamental rights taken away across this country who are rising up to do something about it. And I'm proud to be one of the leaders who was part of that movement.
Right. And as said before, these are all issues that are going to really impact young people coming up. They may be young now, but eventually they'll be able to vote and they're going to get into jobs. They're going to go to college. And you have 2 young kids at home.
Sure.
How has your experience as being a father given you a greater perspective on these types of policies and issues?
Well, it certainly has made me more humble. Parenting does that. I never drank coffee every day until my second child. There are just certain realities that you have a certain humility that comes with being a parent. Kids put everything in perspective in the most wonderful possible way. They remind you that your decisions last a long time. There also are some very specific things I've learned as a parent. Both of my kids are really into sports right now, and I have seen how incredibly important the access to activities outside of academics in school and access to things like individual and team sports can really help shape young kids. And there certainly are related policy issues where I'm a much more of even more fierce advocate for every single child having access to the confidence building, the teamwork skills, the self-confidence, the exercise that comes with kids sports. I always knew that was important, but it wasn't until I saw how transformational it was for my own kids' lives that I think became this much of a fierce advocate for things like that.
Right. I want to move on to the next question about voting. And in your opinion, how can we effectively address the barriers that often prevent young people from voting, especially with the ideas of lack of information or even just interest?
Look, on interest, I think it is the politicians' responsibility to give candidates and leaders to give people something to be excited about, not just to expect that they're going to vote because it's their duty. Most of my background's in the private sector, and so I sometimes think about our democracy in terms of a market, like you would any other market. There is a market for democracy. Voters are the consumers. Many people, and especially in a place like New Hampshire, most people vote and they participate and they're active consumers, but not everyone does. And when you a business and you're offering a product, and some of the voters don't take you up on it, or some of the consumers don't take you up on it, you don't blame them and tell them that they're wrong.
Right.
You make a better product.
Yeah.
And in my lifetime, I mean, I remember my first job was at a movie rental store, and this is an industry that doesn't exist anymore, and got totally displaced by Netflix. And at first, Netflix would send the DVDs to your house, and then DVDs didn't exist anymore, and it's just streaming, right? What they did was like build a better mousetrap, and the Blockbusters of the world are gone, but Netflix is one of the most powerful, successful, biggest companies in the world now. And we need politicians and leaders who are willing to be aggressive, do more, give people a reason to show up and vote. So I think most of the responsibility lies on leaders. I will also say there are some mechanical things we can do to make it easier. New Hampshire gets some things right, like we have paper ballots and we have same-day voter registration, which is fantastic. We could make it easier to vote by absentee, vote by mail. There have been a lot of efforts to make it harder for college kids and young people to vote in the state, which is just ridiculous. I think we can do a lot better job there. So some of those mechanical things can matter a lot.
I do want to ask if you could tell me the story of when you first voted.
I'll tell you what I can remember about it. And it's more complicated than it should be. So let's see, I turned 18 in 1997 or 1998. Yeah, 1997. So I think the 1998 election was the first election that I voted in. I bounced around a lot when I was a kid. When I moved to New Hampshire a couple years after that, in my early 20s, it was the 18th house I ever lived in. And I never really had a home until I lived here. Never felt that way. And so, like, when I went off to college after high school, I only came back for one summer after college. I came back and I worked at a Circuit City store, kind of like Best Buy, the summer between my freshman and sophomore year. But after that, I never really came home. And so in my first election, it was more complicated than it should be. I voted by absentee, but it was odd because it was like first voting by absentee when I think I voted in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I'd gone to high school. So I voted by absentee from where I was living, which was probably Northern Virginia at the time when I was in college. And what I remember is it was at the last minute. I actually had to go. This shows how much of a nerd I am. I had to go and do an overnight or 2-day FedEx in order to get my ballot in on time because I was worried it wouldn't happen late. So I ended up spending like $10 or $15 to vote, which is ridiculous. I'm probably the only 18-year-old
actually can pay to vote.
Yeah, who goes to the post office to get a 2-day envelope in order to get his absentee ballot in on time. So it was a little oddly complicated, but I will say it kind of informs my thinking today because when people say, for example, students who are going to college in New Hampshire shouldn't be able to vote here, it shows a total misunderstanding of what it means to be a young person or to go to school, because being in college here doesn't necessarily mean you're going to ever go back somewhere else.
Right.
It doesn't mean you actually even have a home that you think of before here. Like sometimes your home is where you are in that moment, in that semester, in that year, where you're building a life, where you have a job. And I think navigating that is part of what it means to grow up. And the last thing we need to do is a government that makes it harder for people to figure those things out.
And for a state that has an aging population, we're doing much as possible to encourage young people who are going to college here to stay in the state. And allowing them to vote kind of gives them feel like this is home that they're at, and this could be their home for the rest of their lives if they choose to stay here.
I feel really passionate about it because I came here when I was 21 or 22 years old, had never really had a home until here. And now I'm 45 and I have 2 kids who were born here and live a mile from the hospital that they were born in. And I've built my entire life here. And a lot of my passion for the state is because this is the first home I've ever really had. So I've lived that journey myself when you kind of come here as a young person and decide to make your life here and build a whole life and build relationships across the state. To me, there's something really sacred about that.
Exactly. And if you get elected, what will you do to appeal to young people and get us as young people to support you in your campaign?
Well, I appreciate you asking, and I love that you're giving me a forum like this because I think talking and listening to young people is a really important part of it. It's something I've already tried to do in my campaign, spending time on some of our college campuses, having folks on our team who are young and who just graduated recently from college here in New Hampshire and are involved. Partly, I believe this is about fighting for issues that matter to young people. Reproductive rights and college costs are 2 of the central issues that I'm talking about in the campaign. I also spend a lot of time talking about climate, which is a really important issue I've heard from a lot of young people about. But I also don't expect to have all the answers. I want to stay connected with the people that I represent all across the state, and that includes people of every generation. I'm really excited about the idea of a congressional delegation that could include Jean Shaheen and Maggie Hassan and Chris Pappas and myself. We come from different generations and genders and different family stages, but I think that mix of voices and backgrounds and experiences could be a really powerful one, and I'm really excited to have the chance to be part of it.
That's great. And to the point you're making earlier, I've worked on campaigns myself before, and when I went up to Hanover, I went to Dartmouth, I've probably never seen such a passionate group of people. It was at the school. I went on election day.
Yeah.
And the line was just massive. And there were so many young people there. And they all had signs. And I got to talk to them. They really do care. I think there's a lot of times we neglect young people in our society and that their voice does matter and their opinions do matter. And they really do want to vote. And sometimes as a country, we block them. But
yeah, we should be making it easier, not making it harder.
Right.
And I do think for not just college kids, but for young people in general, when I was in business school, so it was a few years after that, but when I was in business school there, I spent time working in one of the restaurants on Main Street. I was involved in the community, volunteered for some nonprofits. We should be encouraging young people to do more to get invested in our communities here in New Hampshire. And I think a lot of us want to, and a lot of us end up building our lives here. And, 45, like I said, is probably older than most of your listeners, but it still is a lot more connected to some of those experiences that many of the folks in Washington. And I'm excited to be able to, when Annie Custer announced that she was retiring, and I've been really honored to have her support in the race. Part of what I heard from her is that she wanted to pass the torch to the next generation. I think that's healthy. I think it's an important part of the process, and I'm proud to have a chance to carry that torch too.
Exactly. And that is something that will continue on and on again.
With
every generation,
it.
We should be hopefully passing the torch to the next generation behind us. Thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Youth in the Booth is recorded here at Concord Community Television Studios at Concord High School. If you're interested in seeing more from my podcast, you can check out my Instagram at Youth in the Booth Podcast, or check out the website www.youthinthebooth.com.